In the mid to late 70s, New York City was being terrorized by a monster in the area. Police would know him as the .44 caliber killer by the caliber of gun he used to kill with. Nearly every time he struck, he would target and shoot couples sitting in their car. During his reign of terror, 6 lives would be taken and 11 others wounded. At the time, the inhabitants of the Big Apple were plagued with fear, many afraid to even leave their homes. You might know the killer by a different name. David Berkowitz, or Son of Sam, would be apprehended for his crimes, and he was sentenced to 6 life sentences, in which he is still serving to this day. He would claim that he committed those atrocities at his dog's command. Some would say he was involved with a cult, and maybe others were involved too, but that might be a deep dive for another time. When he was caught, New Yorkers would breathe a sigh of relief, and they would finally feel safe. But just 3 years later, in the fall of 1980, terror would once again visit the state of New York. A new serial killer had emerged. The killings would begin in Buffalo, and interestingly enough, would make its way down to NYC. In the case of David Berkowitz, he would mainly target couples sitting in their cars, but this killer would target black males, and although he would discriminate on the basis of race, he wouldn't discriminate on his victim's age. On September 22, 1980, Glenn Dunn was sitting in a parked car at a local supermarket in Buffalo. Suddenly, without warning, a man approached him and raised a gun he had been carrying in a paper bag. The assailant shot Dunn 3 times in the head and neck, killing him. Glenn Dunn was only 14 years old. Over the next 2 days, the killings would continue. The next day, 32-year-old Harold Green was gunned down in his car, in relatively the same fashion, as he was parked at a fast food restaurant. That same night, 30-year-old Emmanuel Thomas was shot and killed as he was walking down the street, mere blocks away from where Green was killed. The shooter would travel to Niagara Falls, and the next day, 43-year-old Joseph McCoy was also shot while taking a walk. While the first killing may have been thought of as an isolated incident, the 4 killings had 2 things in common. All the victims had been black, and they were all killed by a .22 caliber gun. The police entertained the notion that they had a serial killer on the loose. The perpetrator behind these vicious attacks would surprise a lot of people. After that, the killings would stop, but they would resume after only 2 weeks. From this point forward, the perpetrator would not use a gun. On October 8, 1980, cab drivers Parler Edwards, 71, and 40-year-old Ernest Jones would be bludgeoned to death. Edwards was found in the trunk of his cab in Amherst. Ernest Jones from Tonawanda near Buffalo was found near the Niagara River. They were both black men, and both had been found with their hearts cut out. On October 10th, 37-year-old Colin Cole was strangled by an unknown assailant. And the man that strangled him said, "I hate black people," but in a more derogatory way. Fortunately, he would survive. People were in full panic mode by this point, especially the black community in and around the city of Buffalo. They were concerned for their safety, and concerned that the police were not working hard enough to find this psycho and to get him off the streets. Fortunately, by this point the killings would cease, at least in Buffalo for the time being. This racist monster would control his urges to kill men from the opposite race. In November, the man who had been senselessly and savagely murdering people was ready to follow through on a life-changing decision. He decided that he was going to join the army. Joseph Gerald Christopher was born on July 26, 1955 in Buffalo, New York. His father Nicholas worked for the city sanitation department, while Mother Therese was a registered nurse. Being of Italian descent, they lived in a predominantly Italian-American working-class neighborhood. By all accounts of what I've read, Joseph had a normal average upbringing. No abuse that I've come across, at least. Joseph had 3 sisters, 2 older ones and 1 younger one. The family were very devout Catholics, who attended Sunday Mass regularly. Nicholas seemed genuinely interested in spending quality time with the children. He would show Joseph how to shoot a gun at a young age, and showed him how to handle them responsibly. Joseph thought the world of his dad, and loved spending time with him outdoors. While overall Joseph did not excel in school, he always did well in shop class. Even at a young age, he assisted his father building a 3-room cabin out of plywood on a piece of land that Nicholas had purchased in Ellington, approximately 40 miles from Buffalo. While Joseph had a passion for creating and building things, other subjects in school could not keep his interest. He would fail science and English, which were required subjects to advance and graduate. He would ultimately make the decision to drop out. Teachers would later describe Joseph as quiet, polite, and unassuming. Spoiler alert, the events that would unfold years later would catch everyone off guard. Nobody saw it coming. Joseph was not said to be short-tempered. He did not preach the superiority of the white race. He did not vocalize his hate or dislike of the black race or any other race. After dropping out, Joe would work odd jobs, working as a handyman for neighbors. He was said to be able to fix anything. He tried to start his own home improvement business, but with startup costs and competition being so fierce, it never really took off. He attempted to join the army, but it didn't pan out, reportedly because he had been suffering from a hernia. In 1976, Joe's father Nicholas died suddenly. It was a huge blow to Joseph. This was his hero. The man taught him everything that he knew, and it was a hard pill to swallow that he was actually gone. But in order to move on, he devoted all his time into working to keep his mind occupied. He took a job as an unarmed security guard, where he sometimes would work over 80 hours a week. But not wanting to do that forever, he ended up taking a job working the graveyard shift as a maintenance man at Canisius College in Buffalo. His co-worker Ernest Smith was a black man, and him and Joe got along famously. They would talk, laugh, bullshit, even smoke weed together at the end of their shift. Mr. Smith said he never saw an ounce of racism in Joe, that the only thing Joe ever mentioned was that some black guys ripped him off one time, but he didn't show any anger or resentment to the black community over this isolated incident. He just said that Joe had no strong feelings on race, one way or the other. At this period in 1978, Joe had started dating a secretary that worked on campus. They would end up moving in together. They had a good relationship according to her. She actually worked as a shooting instructor, and after he became a member of the NRA, she helped him be a shooting instructor too. But it was also in 1978 when Joe's whole demeanor had started to change. His mental health was in decline. Unbeknownst to everyone that knew him, he was actually a paranoid schizophrenic. Schizophrenia is a mental health disorder that affects the way a person thinks, feels, and acts. Schizophrenia is a manageable disorder that millions of people worldwide have experienced. But if left untreated, the patient may start to experience episodes, whereas one might have delusions and/or hallucinations. They may not be able to tell when something is real or not. The longer they go untreated, the further they delve away from reality. A few warning signs for schizophrenia are fatigue and a sudden change in personality. Also, one might disconnect from others and show some hostility. In 1978, Joe started to act very differently. He suddenly broke up with his live-in girlfriend, who he before claimed that he loved. She was caught completely off guard, but their lives had gone in totally different paths, and there was a 9-year age difference between the two of them. So she attributed the breakup to this. Joe basically just told her it was time for him to move on. A short while later, Joe would have an altercation with his co-worker Ernest Smith, when Joe had accused Ernest of stealing his knife that had turned up missing. Even after the knife turned up in Joe's own truck, Joe wouldn't want anything to do with Ernest. He would act moody and distant towards him thereafter. The two men used to lift weights after their shift ended, or they'd go shoot a game of pool. But whatever friendship they had or bond they once shared was now over. Joe would end up getting fired when he was found to be sleeping on the job. From there, he would move back in with his mother. Between 1979 and 1980, he didn't really have any gainful employment. It seemed like he was isolating himself, disconnected from the outside world, with his mental health continuing to rapidly decline. In August of 1980, when Joe ran into his old co-worker Ernest Smith on the street, Ernest was very surprised by Joe's appearance. Joe's face was beet red and bloated, and he said to Ernest that he had started drinking again. That comment was especially odd to Ernest, because he said that Joe would never drink, never touch the stuff, and now Joe was saying that he started drinking again. 1 month later, in September of 1980, Joseph had recognized that he should seek help. He could tell that he was not well at this point, and his situation was not going to magically get better on its own. He made the sole decision to try to admit himself to the Buffalo Psychiatric Center, but unfortunately, they would deny his entry. Because of the lack of staff and resources, they said they could not take him because they did not see him as an immediate threat to himself or to others. They suggested that he should instead look into going into therapy. With that, Joseph turned and walked away from the facility. He would not look into getting into therapy, and in 2 short weeks, the state of New York would be under siege, with people getting killed and others afraid to leave their homes. When Joe joined the service in November as an Army private, nothing seemed off about this 25-year-old, and this was just weeks after the killings in Buffalo and Niagara Falls. Of course, no one knew at the time that Joe was the guilty party. His friends at base, both black and white, described Joe as polite and gregarious, that he might yell, but he wasn't a fighter. He didn't have any strong feelings of race. The same statement would be repeated. There were some who say he might get upset if he felt he was being ridiculed, but it wasn't alarming enough to think Joe was violent or have psychotic episodes. Joe would be able to leave on a 2-week furlough over the course of the Christmas holiday. He would leave his base on December 19th. He wouldn't arrive home in Buffalo until Christmas night on December 25th. By December 22nd, multiple stabbings had started to occur in New York City by a madman that the media was referring to as the Midtown Slasher. Between the late morning and early afternoon, 2 black men had been stabbed in Lower Manhattan, but fortunately, they would both survive the vicious attacks. The next 4 victims, however, would not be so lucky. The knife wielder kept finding new victims and didn't stop until around midnight. Luis Rodriguez, Anton Davis, Richard Renner, and Carl Ramsey were the names of the men that lost their lives. They were all black except for Rodriguez, who was Hispanic. But he was of dark complexion, so it's plausible that the killer saw him as a black man. As stated earlier, Joe made it home to Buffalo, and the next killings would not occur until December 29th. Over the next 4 days, more black men would be stabbed for merely existing, for walking down the street, for minding their own business, for sitting at a bus stop. But the killings this time would not occur in New York City. They would occur in Buffalo, where they started, and one would occur in Rochester, approximately 75 miles away. In all, over that 4-day stretch, 2 would die, including Roger Adams and Wendell Barnes. 3 others were stabbed but would make recoveries. The last stabbing was done on January 1st. The stabbings had finally ceased. Joe Christopher went back down to Fort Benning, Georgia on January 5th. On January 18th, just 2 weeks after Private Christopher had returned, he would end up stabbing a fellow private, Leonard Coles. Coles would wriggle away and survive this savage, unprovoked attack. After Joe was caught and put in the stockade, he would try to take his own life. He produced a disposable razor he must have been concealing, and started to cut at his own groin area. He would be found and taken to the Army hospital, where he'd be patched up. It seemed he would be okay, at least physically. When he was made to see the Army shrink, he would admit that he had killed blacks in Buffalo and New York. When asked why he did that, Joe answered that he had to. Buffalo police were quickly notified. They did searches on both of the Christopher homes, the one in Buffalo and the one in Ellington. Police would find .22 caliber ammunition, a couple sawed-off gun stocks, the sawed-off barrel of a .22 caliber rifle, and some knives. And maybe the most damaging was the used .22 caliber shell casings they found in the home. The markings on the casings conclusively matched the ones at the scenes of the shootings in Buffalo. Police looked into seeing if it was entirely plausible for Joe to have committed these horrendous acts. They looked at the timeline of events and where Joe was or could have been, and determined it was absolutely possible for him to be present when the crimes occurred. Joe would be charged with the Buffalo shooting murders. In true Darrell Brooks fashion, he chose to represent himself, even though his mother had provided 2 attorneys that were a lot more capable than he was. He would be found guilty in April 1982 and sentenced to 60 years, but the conviction would be overturned because the defense was not allowed to provide testimony surrounding Joe's mental health. In 1985, he was found guilty and convicted of the New York killings, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Joseph Christopher would claim that he had killed 13 people, although there are only 12 that we know of. But what drove him to kill the way he did? To snap? To target black men? He had said one time that he had to, and I read somewhere that he might have been hearing voices to carry out these evil deeds. This one is a real head-scratcher. He was a paranoid schizophrenic. That is not to say that he is not responsible for his actions, though. But could he have been helped? And if he was taken in and admitted by the psychiatric ward, could lives have been saved? Everyone that knew him said he was the most normal guy, not a racist bone in his body. So what happened? What am I missing here? He went from your average, everyday Joe to the .22 caliber killer, to the Midtown slasher. What are your thoughts on this?